The hospital room was too quiet for a moment that should have been filled with life, the kind of silence that pressed against the chest and made breathing feel like work. Machines stood still, their blinking lights now meaningless, and the faint smell of antiseptic lingered in the air like something that refused to leave. Alexander Reed stood in the middle of it all, unmoving, as if the world had continued spinning without him. In his arms, wrapped in a soft white blanket, was his newborn daughter. She was warm, alive, crying, and yet nothing felt real. Only hours ago, he had been pacing these same floors, checking his watch, speaking to doctors with controlled urgency, believing everything would be fine because it always had been. He was a man who fixed problems, a man who built solutions out of chaos. That was who he was, that was who he had always been. But now, none of that mattered. She didn't make it. The words still echoed in his mind, refusing to settle, refusing to make sense. Elena was gone, just like that. The woman who had filled his life with warmth, who had softened his sharp edges without ever trying, who had believed in him long before the world ever knew his name, gone in the same moment their daughter took her first breath. Alexander didn't cry, not because he didn't feel it, but because the pain was too large, too overwhelming to come out in something as simple as tears. It locked itself deep inside him, behind a wall that had been built in seconds. Shock had taken over where grief should have lived. The baby in his arms cried louder, her tiny face turning red, her body trembling with life. He looked down at her, but there was a strange distance in his gaze. Not rejection, not anger, just absence. It was too much at once, life and death colliding in the same heartbeat. A nurse had tried to guide him, speaking gently, explaining what to do, how to hold her, how to comfort her, but her voice sounded far away, like it was coming from the end of a long tunnel. He nodded when necessary, responded when expected, but nothing truly registered. When they finally left him alone in the room, the silence grew heavier. The baby's cries echoed against the walls, filling every corner, refusing to be ignored. Alexander sat down slowly, staring at her, unsure of what she needed, unsure of what he was supposed to do. He had built companies worth millions, negotiated deals that changed industries, commanded rooms full of powerful people. But this tiny human in his arms, he didn't understand her. Days passed, but time didn't feel like it was moving forward. It felt stuck, looping, dragging him through the same emotions over and over again. The mansion he returned to felt different now. It was too big, too quiet, too empty. Every room carried Elena's presence, her laughter, her voice, her touch. Her absence was louder than anything else. He didn't touch her things, couldn't. Her clothes remained in the closet, her perfume still sat on the dresser, her books stayed open where she had left them. It felt wrong to move anything, as if doing so would erase her completely. But the baby didn't understand grief. She didn't understand loss. She only knew need, and she cried. She cried in the morning, her small voice cutting through the silence like a blade. She cried in the afternoon, her restlessness filling the halls, and at night, her cries became unbearable, stretching for hours, echoing through the mansion until even the walls seemed to feel it. Alexander tried everything. He followed instructions from books, watched videos, listened to professionals. He bought the best equipment money could offer: smart cribs, automated rockers, temperature-controlled nurseries, sound machines designed by experts. None of it worked. He held her awkwardly, pacing the floor, whispering words he didn't know how to say. He tried singing, his voice rough and unfamiliar to himself. He fed her, burped her, changed her, checked everything over and over again, but nothing lasted. The silence never stayed. Sleep became a stranger. Nights blurred into mornings, and mornings dragged into nights. His reflection changed. The sharp, composed man he once saw in the mirror was now replaced by someone exhausted, someone worn down by something he couldn't control. Work began to slip. Meetings were missed. Calls went unanswered. His assistant noticed first, then his board. Questions started to rise, quiet at first, then louder. Was he losing control? Was the man who built everything starting to fall apart? But none of it mattered to him. Not anymore. The only thing that filled his world now was the sound of his daughter crying. One night it became too much. She had been crying for hours. Nothing worked. Nothing helped. Alexander sat on the floor beside the crib, his back against the wall, his hands gripping his hair as if trying to hold himself together. His eyes were red, his body heavy with exhaustion, his mind filled with noise. Please, he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to. Maybe Elena, maybe himself, maybe the universe. The baby cried louder, and then, something inside him cracked. Tears came, not controlled, not silent, but raw. They fell freely as he lowered his head, his shoulders shaking under the weight of everything he had been holding in. He wasn't the man he used to be. He couldn't fix this. He couldn't control it. He couldn't do it alone. That realization settled heavily in his chest. The next morning, after a night that felt endless, he made the decision. He needed help. Saying the words felt strange, unnatural. He wasn't used to depending on anyone. But this wasn't business. This wasn't something he could solve with strategy or intelligence. This was something else entirely. He picked up his phone, his fingers hesitating for a brief moment before dialing. "I need a nanny." The words came out flat, but they carried everything behind them. Exhaustion, defeat, hope. The agency responded quickly. Questions followed. Details, preferences, expectations. Alexander answered as little as possible. "I don't care about qualifications," he said, his voice tired. "I just need someone who can make her stop crying." Candidates began arriving soon after, one after another, each more polished than the last. Impressive resumes, years of experience, perfect recommendations. They spoke confidently, offering plans, routines, techniques. Alexander listened, but something felt off. They sounded rehearsed, distant, like they were applying a formula to something that didn't feel like it should be a formula. None of them stayed. Days passed. His patience grew thinner. His hope began to fade again. And then, on a quiet afternoon, when he was too tired to expect anything different, she arrived. Mara stepped into the mansion without hesitation, but without arrogance either. She didn't look like the others. Her clothes were simple, slightly worn, her posture calm but unassuming. There was nothing polished about her, nothing designed to impress. Alexander barely looked up at first. "You've read the situation?" he asked, his tone distant. "Yes," she replied softly. "And you think you can handle it?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I'd like to meet her first." That answer made him pause. No rehearsed speech, no overconfidence, just truth. He gestured toward the stairs. "She's upstairs." The crying had already started again. It echoed through the house, familiar and exhausting. Mara didn't react with panic or urgency. She simply walked toward the sound, steady and calm. Alexander followed, though he wasn't sure why. When they entered the nursery, the baby was already red-faced, her cries filling the room completely. The same as always, the same desperation, the same failure waiting to happen. Mara moved closer, her steps quiet. She didn't rush. She didn't reach for anything. She simply leaned over the crib and looked at the child for a moment, as if trying to understand her. Then she picked her up. Her movements were gentle, natural, like she had done this 1,000 times before. She held the baby close, not trying to fix anything, not trying to force calm. And then, she began to sing. It wasn't loud. It wasn't perfect. It was soft, steady, almost like a whisper wrapped in melody. A lullaby that didn't sound practiced, but lived in. Alexander stood still. The crying didn't stop immediately, but it changed. It softened, slowed. The tension in the baby's body eased, her small hands relaxing, her breathing shifting, and then, silence. Just like that. Alexander's chest tightened, not with pain this time, but something else, something unfamiliar. Hope. Alexander didn't realize he had stopped breathing until his chest tightened and forced him to inhale. The silence in the room felt unreal, almost fragile, like it might shatter if anyone moved too quickly. His daughter, who had spent weeks crying as if the world itself had wronged her, now rested quietly in the arms of a stranger. Mara continued humming softly, her voice steady, unforced, as if the melody wasn't something she was performing but something she was simply allowing to exist. The baby's tiny fingers curled gently against the fabric of her dress, her face relaxed in a way Alexander had never seen before. He stared at them, unable to look away. "How?" His voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat, trying again. "How did you do that?" Mara didn't look at him immediately. She kept her focus on the baby, rocking slightly, her movements slow and natural. "I didn't do anything special," she said quietly. She just needed someone to listen. Alexander frowned slightly, confused. "Listen? She's a baby." Mara finally glanced up at him, not challenging, not defensive, just calm. "Babies feel everything," she said. "They don't understand words, but they understand energy. She's been surrounded by tension, by trying, by noise that doesn't comfort her. Her gaze softened as she looked back at the child. She needed stillness. The words settled into the room, simple but heavy. Alexander didn't respond. He didn't know how to. For weeks he had done everything possible, every solution, every tool, every piece of advice, and yet, none of it had worked. Now, this woman stood in his home, doing something so simple, it almost felt insulting to everything he had tried. And yet, "You're hired," he said suddenly, the decision coming before he could overthink it. Mara blinked, slightly surprised by how quickly the words came. "Just like that?" "Yes." She hesitated for a moment, as if weighing something internally. "All right," she said softly. That night was different. Alexander didn't expect much. He had already convinced himself that what he had seen earlier might have been luck. A moment, something temporary. But as the evening stretched into night, something strange happened. The crying didn't return, not in the same way. There were small sounds, soft whimpers, but each time, Mara responded with the same calm presence. No rush, no panic, just quiet understanding. And each time, the baby settled again. Alexander found himself standing in the hallway more than once, listening. Not to chaos, not to desperation, but to something he hadn't heard in weeks. Peace. When he finally lay down in his bed, exhaustion still heavy in his body, the silence didn't feel suffocating anymore. It felt gentle. Sleep came easier that night. The days that followed began to take on a rhythm. At first, Alexander told himself he was simply observing, making sure he had made the right decision, watching Mara closely, noting her behavior, her routines, her interactions. It was habit, control, the same mindset he had always applied to everything in his life. But what he noticed wasn't what he expected. Mara didn't act like someone working in a billionaire's home. She didn't seem impressed by the size of the mansion or the luxury surrounding her. She moved through the space as if none of it mattered, focusing only on what she was there for, the baby. She didn't rely on gadgets or schedules. She didn't follow strict routines written in books. Instead, she watched, listened, adjusted. Sometimes she would sit quietly with the baby for long stretches, not speaking, not moving much, just being present. Other times, she would hum those same soft lullabies, her voice filling the room in a way that felt grounding. Alexander couldn't explain it, but every time she sang, something in him settled too. He started spending more time at home. At first it was small changes, leaving the office a little earlier, taking calls from his study instead of the boardroom, telling himself it was temporary, that he just needed to make sure everything was stable. But as days turned into weeks, the shift became more noticeable. One afternoon, he found himself standing by the nursery door again. It had become another habit, standing there, watching. Leia was running across the grass, her small steps unsteady but determined. Mara followed a few steps behind, her pace relaxed, her attention fully on the child. The sun filtered through the trees, casting soft light across the scene. The air was fresh, calm. It felt peaceful. Alexander crossed his arms loosely, his gaze fixed on them. He didn't realize how much time had passed, until it happened. Leia tripped. It was small, nothing serious, but her reaction was immediate. Her face crumpled, her breath catching before the cry came. "Mara!" The word came out clearly, without hesitation, without confusion. Mara was already moving, kneeling down, gathering the child into her arms before the cry could fully form. "It's okay," she murmured, brushing hair away from Leia's face. "You're okay." The child clung to her instantly, her small fingers gripping tightly, and just like that, the tears stopped. Alexander felt something twist in his chest. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly, but it wasn't nothing either. He stepped forward slowly, stopping a few feet away. "Is she all right?" he asked. Mara nodded, still holding Leia. "Just a small fall." Leia looked up at him, her expression already calmer. "I'm okay," she said softly. He nodded. Good. But his gaze lingered, on the way she held Mara, on the way Mara held her back. It was natural, effortless, and it made something inside him feel uncertain. That night, the air between them shifted again, subtly, but noticeably. They found themselves in the same room more often. Conversations stretched a little longer than necessary. Silences lingered without feeling awkward, but without feeling entirely comfortable either. Something unspoken had begun to exist between them, and neither of them addressed it. One evening, as the house settled into quiet again, Alexander found Mara in the kitchen. She stood by the counter, her hands wrapped around a simple cup, her gaze distant. He paused in the doorway. "You should get some rest," he said. She looked up, slightly surprised. "I will. You've been up early every day. So have you." He didn't respond to that. Instead, he stepped further into the room. "You don't have to do everything yourself," he said. "There's staff." "I know," she replied. "But I don't mind." There was a brief silence. Then, without thinking, he asked, "Why did you take this job?" Mara hesitated. It wasn't a question she had expected. "I needed work," she said simply. "That's all?" She met his gaze. "For some people, that's enough reason." He studied her for a moment. "There's more," he said. She didn't deny it, but she didn't explain either. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but not everything needs to be said right away." Her answer lingered. Alexander nodded slowly. He didn't push further. But something told him there was more to her than he understood, and that realization only made things more complicated. Because whatever this was, whatever had started to grow between them, it wasn't simple, and it wasn't going away. Winter arrived slowly, but once it settled, it wrapped the entire estate in a quiet stillness that felt both peaceful and heavy at the same time. Snow gathered along the edges of the garden, soft and untouched, while the windows fogged gently from the warmth inside. The world outside seemed to pause, as if everything had agreed to move a little slower. Inside the house, things had changed in ways that could no longer be ignored. Laya was growing. It showed in the way she walked now, less uncertain, more confident. In the way she spoke, forming words that once seemed impossible. In the way her laughter came freely, filling rooms that had once been silent. But most of all, it showed in who she reached for. More often than not, it was Mara. Alexander noticed it every time. He told himself it was natural. Mara spent more time with her. She was there for the small moments, the daily routines, the quiet needs. Of course, the child would grow attached to her. It made sense. But understanding something didn't make it easier to feel. One afternoon, as snow fell lightly outside, Alexander stood near the large window in the sitting room, watching the soft white flakes drift down. The fire behind him crackled gently, adding warmth to the quiet space. Laya sat on the floor nearby, surrounded by toys, her attention shifting from one to another in quick bursts of curiosity. Mara was beside her, not directing, not interrupting, just present. Alexander turned slightly, his gaze resting on them. It had become a familiar sight, too familiar. "Look," Laya said suddenly, holding up a small wooden block as if it was something extraordinary. Mara smiled. "That's a good one." Alexander watched as Laya turned toward Mara first, seeking her reaction before anyone else's. Something tightened in his chest again. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't overwhelming, but it was there, constant. He stepped closer, crouching down slightly. "What about me?" he said, his tone lighter than he felt. "Don't I get to see?" Laya looked at him, then back at Mara, then held the block out toward him. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. He took it carefully, nodding. "Very impressive." She smiled, and for a brief moment, the tension inside him eased, but it didn't disappear, because the truth remained. There was something he didn't fully understand happening, and it was getting harder to ignore. That evening, the house settled into its usual rhythm. Laya had fallen asleep earlier than usual, worn out from a day of play. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It felt natural. Alexander found himself in the study, staring at a document he hadn't read for the past 10 minutes. His mind wasn't there. It hadn't been for days. A quiet knock broke his thoughts. "Come in." Mara stepped inside, her presence as calm as ever. "She's asleep," she said softly. He nodded. "Thank you." She hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether to leave immediately or stay. "You don't have to report everything," he added, noticing her pause. "I know," she said. "I just thought you'd want to know." "I do." The words came out more quickly than he expected. She gave a small nod. Another silence followed. Neither of them moved to fill it. Alexander leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her. "You've changed this place," he said. Mara frowned faintly. "I didn't mean to. That's not a bad thing." She didn't respond right away. "I just did my job," she said after a moment. "No," he replied quietly. "You did more than that." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something shifted. Not dramatically, not obviously, but enough. Mara looked away first. "You should get some rest," she said softly. "You've been working a lot." He almost laughed at that. If only she knew. "Good night, Mara," Good night. She left the room quietly, closing the door behind her. Alexander exhaled slowly, running a hand across his face. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. Not again. Not after everything. And yet, it was happening. Days passed, but the tension didn't fade. If anything, it grew, not in a dramatic way, but in small, persistent moments. A glance that lasted a second too long, a conversation that lingered longer than necessary, a silence that carried more meaning than words. They both felt it, even if neither of them said it. One night, the storm returned. Rain against the windows, wind through the trees, the kind of night that made everything feel closer. Alexander walked through the house, unable to sleep again. It had become a pattern, but tonight felt different. He didn't go to the nursery. He didn't go to the study. Instead, he followed the faint sound of music. It led him back to the piano room. Mara was there again, sitting at the bench, her fingers resting on the keys, playing softly. The melody was slow, uncertain at first, then gradually more confident. He didn't interrupt. He stood in the doorway, listening. She noticed him this time, but she didn't stop. She kept playing, and somehow, that made it harder to leave. When the song ended, the silence between them felt heavier than before. "You should sleep," she said quietly. "So should you." She smiled faintly. "I couldn't. Neither could I." Another pause. Then, before he could stop himself, he stepped further into the room. "You're more than just a nanny," he said. Mara looked up, her expression shifting slightly. "I never said I wasn't," she replied. "That's not what I mean." "I know." Her voice was softer now, careful, as if she understood where this was going, and wasn't sure she should let it. Alexander took another step. Whatever this is," he said, his voice lower, less certain than usual. "It's not simple." "No," Mara agreed. "It's not." "Then why does it feel like it's happening anyway?" She held his gaze. "Because some things don't ask for permission." The words settled heavily between them. Alexander felt it then, clearly, undeniably. He wasn't just grateful for her anymore. He wasn't just observing her. He wasn't just adjusting to her presence. He was attached. And that realization scared him, more than anything else had in a long time. Mara stood slowly, creating distance between them. "That doesn't mean we should ignore reality," she said quietly. "What reality?" She looked at him, her expression steady but not cold. "You loved someone," she said, deeply. "I still do. I know." Silence. "Then this. Whatever it is," she continued. "It's complicated." He let out a slow breath. "Everything in my life is complicated. This is different." "How?" "Because this isn't something you can control." That hit harder than he expected. Because she was right, and he hated it. He looked at her for a long moment, then asked the question he had been avoiding. "What do you feel?" Mara didn't answer immediately. She looked away, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the piano. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "I feel like I don't want to lose what we have." It wasn't the answer he expected, and yet, it was. "Neither do I," he said. Another silence. Heavy. Full. Then she stepped back again. "We should stop here." "Why?" "Because if we don't, it won't stop later." The truth in her words was undeniable. Alexander knew it, and still, part of him didn't want to listen. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't push. He nodded slowly. "All right." Mara gave a small, almost relieved nod. "Good night, Alexander." "Good night." She walked past him, leaving the room quietly, and just like that, the moment ended. But it didn't disappear, because now it had a name, and once something is named, it's impossible to ignore. The days that followed felt different, even though nothing obvious had changed. The routines stayed the same. Leia woke at the same time, laughed at the same small things, reached for the same familiar comfort. Mara moved through the house with the same quiet confidence, her presence steady, her actions thoughtful. Alexander continued his work, attending meetings, answering calls, maintaining the structure of the empire he had built. And yet, something had shifted. It lived in the silence between words, in the way both of them seemed more aware of each other without trying to be. In the pauses that stretched just a little longer than before, they had drawn a line, but neither of them had truly stepped away from it. One morning, the sky was clear after days of rain. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, warming the marble floors and softening the edges of the rooms. It felt like a new beginning, even if no one said it out loud. Alexander stood near the staircase, watching as Leia carefully made her way down each step with Mara beside her. "I can do it," the child insisted, her small voice filled with determination. "I know you can," Mara replied gently, staying close but not interfering. Alexander watched the exchange with quiet focus. There was something in the way Mara handled these moments, never rushing, never forcing, that he had come to respect deeply. Leia reached the last step and turned immediately, her face lighting up as she spotted him. "Daddy, I did it!" He stepped forward, a faint smile forming without effort. "I saw. That was impressive." She beamed, clearly pleased. Mara stepped back slightly, giving them space without making it obvious. It was something she did often, small, intentional acts that most people wouldn't notice. But Alexander did. He always did. Later that afternoon, he found himself in the study again, though his focus was no better than it had been in recent days. His thoughts drifted constantly, circling back to the same place, the same person. It was becoming harder to ignore. A soft knock interrupted him. "Come in." Mara stepped inside, her posture relaxed but her expression thoughtful. "She's asking for you," she said. Alexander frowned slightly. "For me?" Mara nodded. "She wants you to read to her." The request caught him off guard. "She usually asks for you." "I know." There was something in Mara's tone, something subtle, almost encouraging. Alexander closed his laptop slowly. "All right." He stood, adjusting his sleeves out of habit before following her upstairs. Leia was already waiting, sitting on her bed with a book clutched tightly in her small hands. Her eyes lit up the moment he entered. "You came!" He nodded, stepping closer. "Of course I did." She held the book out toward him. "This one." He took it, sitting down beside her with a slight hesitation, as if unsure of how to fit into this moment. Reading wasn't something he had done often. Not like this. Mara stayed by the door, quiet, observing without intruding. Alexander opened the book, glancing briefly at the pages before beginning. His voice was steady, though not as soft as Mara's, less practiced, less natural. But Leia didn't seem to mind. She leaned against him, her small head resting lightly against his arm as she listened. And slowly, his voice softened. The words came easier. The rhythm found him. By the time he finished, the child was already drifting towards sleep, her breathing slow, her body relaxed. Alexander closed the book gently. For a moment he didn't move. He simply sat there, feeling something unfamiliar settle inside him, a quiet sense of connection. He hadn't realized how much he had been missing it. Mara stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You did well." He looked up at her, something unspoken passing between them again. "She made it easy," he replied. Mara shook her head slightly. "No. You showed up. That matters more." The words stayed with him, long after he left the room. That evening, the air between them felt less tense, but not because the feelings had disappeared. It was because they had both accepted that they were there, not acted on, not resolved, just present. They found themselves sitting in the same room again, the quiet stretching comfortably between them this time. Mara was folding small clothes, her movements steady and precise. Alexander sat across from her, a glass of water untouched in his hand. "You've stayed longer than most would," he said after a while. Mara didn't look up immediately. "I told you I would. People say things all the time. I don't." There was no pride in her voice, just certainty. He studied her for a moment. "Why?" She paused, her hands stilling briefly before continuing. "Because leaving is easy," she said. "Staying is harder." "That doesn't answer the question." Mara glanced up at him, her expression calm but thoughtful. "Maybe I don't want to answer it yet." Alexander leaned back slightly, considering that. "You're careful," he said. "So are you." A faint smile touched his lips. "Not as much as I used to be. That's not a bad thing. Depends on what it leads to." Their eyes met again, and this time, neither of them looked away immediately. There was something there, stronger now, more defined, and impossible to pretend didn't exist. Days turned into months. Time moved forward in a way that felt both slow and fast at the same time. Leia grew more expressive, more aware, more attached. The house continued to change, filling with moments that felt real, lived, meaningful. And Alexander, he changed too. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in ways that mattered. He laughed more, stayed home more, listened more, and without realizing it, he began to depend on Mara in ways that had nothing to do with childcare. It showed in small things, the way he looked for her presence without thinking, the way conversations felt incomplete when she wasn't part of them, the way silence felt different when she wasn't there to fill it with quiet understanding. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting warm light across the garden, Alexander stood outside watching Laya play. Mara was beside him, not speaking, just there, and for once, it felt enough. "You've become part of this place," he said quietly. Mara didn't respond immediately. "I didn't plan to," she admitted. "Neither did I." That made her glance at him. He exhaled slowly, his gaze still on the child. "I've spent my life controlling outcomes," he said, "building things that make sense, that follow logic, and this doesn't?" He shook his head slightly. "No, it doesn't. Does that bother you?" He thought about it, then answered honestly, "It used to." Mara's expression softened slightly. "And now?" He looked at her, directly. "Now, I'm just trying to understand it." There was a long pause. Then she asked the question neither of them had voiced yet. "And what happens when you do?" Alexander didn't answer right away, because the truth was, he already knew. He just wasn't sure if he was ready to say it. Mara lowered her eyes, but she did not step away. The evening breeze moved gently through the garden, carrying the scent of roses and damp earth, while Laya chased the last light across the grass, unaware that the quiet world around her had narrowed to two people standing on the edge of a truth they could no longer outrun. Alexander watched Mara's face, waiting, not with the authority he used in boardrooms or negotiations, but with a kind of fragile patience that felt new to him. He had spent years speaking in certainty, yet now certainty was the one thing he did not have. What he had instead was the sound of his daughter's laughter, the memory of lullabies in dark hallways, and the undeniable knowledge that somewhere along the way, this woman had become woven into every part of the life he thought had ended. "I think," he said at last, his voice quieter than the breeze, "that I already understand it. I just haven't been brave enough to say it aloud." Mara's fingers tightened slightly around the ribbon she had been holding. "And if you do say it?" she asked. Alexander looked toward Laya before answering, as if needing to see the child they both loved. "Then everything changes." Mara let out a small breath. "Everything has already changed." Her words stayed with him through dinner, through bedtime, through the long silence that followed when the house finally settled, and the night pressed softly against the windows. He found himself outside Laya's room again, listening to the low murmur of Mara's voice as she tucked the child into bed. The lullaby floated into the hall, familiar now, almost sacred. It no longer sounded like rescue. It sounded like home. Alexander stood there with one hand resting against the frame of the door, and for the first time he allowed himself to admit something fully, without resistance or guilt or fear bending it into another shape. He loved Mara. Not suddenly, not recklessly. He loved her in the slow way winter became spring, in the quiet way light returned to a house that had once known only shadows. He loved the calm she carried into rooms without trying. He loved the patience in her voice, and the strength hidden beneath her softness. He loved the way she had never tried to replace what had been lost, only to care for what remained. When Mara stepped out and closed the door gently behind her, she saw something in his face that made her pause. "Is she asleep?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Mara nodded. She was fighting it. A faint smile touched his mouth. "She gets that from me." Mara gave him a look that held just a trace of amusement. "That much I know." He should have let her walk past. He should have said good night and retreated into the safety of another unfinished conversation. Instead, he said, "Walk with me." She hesitated only a second before following him down the hallway and toward the glass doors that opened to the terrace. Outside, the night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the dark sky, and the estate seemed hushed beneath them, as if even the world was waiting. For a while they said nothing. Alexander stood with both hands resting on the stone railing, his eyes on the gardens below. Mara remained a step behind at first, then slowly moved beside him. "I used to think grief was something you survived by protecting it," he said eventually, as if letting anything new into my life would somehow lessen what Elena meant to me. Mara listened without interrupting. "I held on so tightly to that fear that I almost turned my home into a monument instead of a life." He looked at her then, "And you walked into it carrying nothing but a suitcase, a tired smile, and a song. You never asked me to heal. You never asked me to move on. You just cared for my daughter. You stayed, and somehow, without demanding anything, you brought me back to myself." Mara's eyes glistened, but she remained steady. "Alexander," she said softly, "you came back because you chose to. I was only there when you did." He shook his head. "No, you were more than there. You were the reason it felt possible." Silence gathered between them again, but this time it was warmer, fuller. Mara looked down at her hands. "I tried very hard not to need anything from you," she admitted. "Not because I didn't feel it, because I did. But your pain was bigger than whatever I wanted, and Laia needed peace more than either of us needed answers." He turned toward her fully. "And what do you want now?" Mara lifted her gaze slowly. For one long second, he saw uncertainty, hope, fear, and love in equal measure. "I want truth," she whispered, "even if it changes everything." Alexander stepped closer. "Then here's the truth. I love you. I have for longer than I was willing to admit. I love the woman who soothed my daughter when I could not. I love the woman who never treated my grief like a burden. I love the woman who made this house feel alive again." A tear slipped down Mara's cheek, and she laughed once, softly, through the emotion. "You make it very hard to answer calmly." His own smile was unsteady. "Then don't answer calmly." She drew in a breath that trembled at the edges. "I love you too." He kissed her carefully, almost reverently, as if he were touching something precious he had no right to rush. It was not the desperate kind of kiss born from hunger or loneliness. It was the slow meeting of two people who had spent years standing beside each other in silence and had finally found the courage to cross the last remaining distance. When they parted, Mara rested her forehead lightly against his chest, and Alexander closed his eyes, holding her as though every fractured piece of his life had at last settled into place. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Words had carried them only so far, the rest belonged to quiet. In the days that followed, nothing dramatic changed on the surface. There was no grand declaration to the staff, no sudden shift in routine, no loud display of something private and still tender. But everything changed in the smaller ways that mattered more. Alexander smiled more easily. Mara no longer left rooms the moment he entered them. Their hands found each other in passing, first cautiously, then naturally. The house noticed before anyone said a word. Warmth has a way of announcing itself without speech. Leia noticed too, though in the simple, direct way only a child can. One morning she looked from Alexander to Mara, across the breakfast table, narrowed her eyes in thought, and asked, "Why are you both smiling like that?" Mara nearly choked on her tea, and Alexander, to his own surprise, laughed aloud. "Like what?" he asked. Leia shrugged. "Like you know a secret." Mara recovered first. "Maybe we do," she said. Leia considered that, then nodded with solemn approval, before returning to her toast. It became one of those family moments no one planned and no one forgot. Spring came gradually, easing color back into the grounds and filling the estate with the sound of birds again. The cherry tree near the garden path began to bloom, pale petals trembling against the sky. It was beneath that tree that Leia had taken some of her first steady steps, with Mara kneeling a few feet away and Alexander watching as if witnessing a miracle. Now Leia ran beneath it with a confidence that made both of them stop and stare sometimes, amazed at how quickly time had moved. One afternoon, while Mara sat on a blanket arranging small cups for a pretend tea party, and Alexander pretended to negotiate with stuffed animals over imaginary cake, Leia climbed into Mara's lap, touched her cheek with a sticky hand, and said, "When I grow up, I want to be like you." Mara smiled, but her eyes filled instantly. "Why me?" she asked. Leia frowned as if the answer should have been obvious. "Because you make everything not scary." The words settled over all three of them. Alexander looked away briefly, swallowing hard. Mara wrapped both arms around the child and kissed the top of her head. "That's the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me," she murmured. Later, when Leia had run off again, Alexander moved beside Mara and sat quietly. "She's right," he said. Mara gave him a sidelong glance. "Children are generous." "No," he replied. "Children are honest." He reached for her hand. "You did make everything less frightening, even the future." Mara leaned into his shoulder, and together they watched their daughter play in the grass, the simplest scene in the world, and somehow the one that mattered most. The question of marriage did not arrive as pressure, it arrived as recognition. They were already living inside the shape of a family, already sharing mornings, worries, laughter, plans, and the steady devotion that outlasts romance and turns into something stronger. Still, Alexander wanted to ask properly. He wanted one moment in his life to be guided not by urgency or crisis, but by deliberate love. He chose a quiet evening near the start of summer. The windows were open, and a breeze carried the scent of lavender from the garden into the piano room. Mara stood by the instrument, absent-mindedly pressing a few notes while waiting for Leia to finish brushing her teeth upstairs with the housekeeper's help. Alexander entered with none of the polished confidence that usually defined him. He looked almost young in his nervousness, as though the years had fallen away and left only the man who once fell in love before the world taught him to hide feeling behind composure. Mara turned when she heard him and smiled. "You're pacing," she said gently. "Am I that obvious?" "To me, yes." He laughed under his breath, then grew serious. "Good, then maybe this will be easier." He stopped in front of her and reached into his pocket. Mara's eyes widened before she even saw the ring. "Alexander, let me say it." She nodded, already emotional. He took her hand. "You came into my life when I had nothing good left to give. You loved my daughter before she could offer anything back. You loved me when I didn't know how to be loved again. I don't want another day of my life that does not have you at its center. Marry me, Mara." Her tears arrived before her answer did, but her answer was there, shining in every part of her face. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, laughing through tears. "Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that were steadier than he felt, and when he kissed her, the piano beside them caught the last golden light of evening, as if blessing the moment in silence. Leia's reaction was more immediate and far less composed. When they told her the next morning, she gasped, clapped both hands over her mouth, and shouted, "So it's real." Alexander stared at her. "You knew?" She rolled her eyes with the dramatic patience of a child who thinks adults miss the obvious. "Daddy, please." Mara laughed so hard she had to sit down. Leia launched herself into her lap and hugged her fiercely. "Does that mean you stay forever?" Mara looked at Alexander before answering, then back at the little girl holding on to her. "Yes, sweetheart, forever." Leia nodded, completely satisfied. "Good, because I already told my dolls." The wedding itself was exactly what both of them wanted. Small, intimate, and honest. No press, no spectacle, only people who had witnessed the hard years and understood the quiet miracle of what this day meant. The garden was dressed simply in white flowers and soft lights. The cherry tree stood in bloom above them like memory transformed into blessing. Mara wore elegance without excess, and Alexander looked at her as though nothing he had ever built could compare to this one moment. Leia scattered petals with more enthusiasm than precision, grinning at everyone who smiled back. When the vows came, they were not ornate. They did not need to be. Alexander promised to honor the love that had brought them there, and the life they would keep building together. Mara promised to remain as she had always been, steadfast, honest, and full of grace. When they kissed, applause rose around them, but what Alexander heard most clearly was Leia's delighted squeal. That night, after the guests had gone and the staff had quietly cleared the last of the dishes, the house settled into a peace unlike any it had ever known. Leia, exhausted by happiness, had fallen asleep early, one hand curled around a flower ribbon from the ceremony. Mara changed out of her dress and wandered barefoot to the piano room, drawn there by instinct more than intention. She sat at the bench and touched the keys softly. A new melody came, shaped by everything that had happened, and everything still to come. Alexander stood in the doorway listening, the way he once had when he was still afraid of what her music meant. He crossed the room and sat beside her. Their shoulders touched. "Play it again," he said quietly. Mara smiled and began once more. The notes rose gently into the room, no longer carrying sorrow as their only language. They carried memory, yes, and gratitude, and the kind of love that had survived grief without erasing it. When the melody ended, Alexander took her hand and kissed her knuckles. "This house was once filled with echoes," he murmured. "Now it's filled with music." Mara leaned her head on his shoulder. "Then let it stay that way." Upstairs, their daughter slept peacefully. Outside, the night held the garden in stillness. And within those walls, where tears had once fallen like rain and silence had once felt unbearable, a family rested at last inside the life they had chosen together.